Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we learn about a specific type of checkmate, which is called the Epaulette mate. It's one of my favorite ones. It's a very elegant type of checkmate. When that happens is, the weaker side, that is the side which is about to get checkmated, has two of his own pieces blocking the king's escape in two different diagonal directions. Let me show you what I mean. Here we go. In this position, black has two rooks on each side of the king. And now, if the white queen attacks the black king from the correct square, that is, from g6, the black king has no way out, specifically because of the two rooks take away the runaway square of the king. At the same time, if white would try to give a different check, for example, from d5, that would not accomplish the goal at all, because the black king could easily walk out and be just fine. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. This is a bit more complex. There are more pieces on the board. And in this position, white has a rook on g7, which, as a matter of fact, is under attack by the black queen. I always suggest to my students that when your opponent makes a move, always think, what does your opponent want to do? And in this case, of course, the answer to that question would be, black wants to capture the white rook. Normally speaking, we tend to react to the threat. However, that certainly would be a mistake in this case. And in general, while we want to be aware of what is our opponent's threat, we always want to at the same time look for the objectively best move. And that may include to ignore the attack, and that can be in situations when we are ready to checkmate or we're ready to win a more important piece of the opponent. In this position, if you recall from some of the previous lessons, white seemingly has an option to give a skewer. Can you figure out the move that can intend to win black's queen with a skewer? Well, I hope you know what I mean. I am talking about the white queen appearing on a3. What happens now is that if the black king moves out of this check, then the white queen indeed can capture the black queen, leaving white with an extra queen. However, it is extremely important that any given position you always look out for the best response of your opponent as well. Don't only be on the search for your own good moves. And in this case, the much better move for black is to interpose the check with the rook and keep the queen safe. And this is a perfect example why it's so important to always be on the lookout for the opponent's correct defense as well, not just your own attacking moves. So in this case, if white would have chosen to give the check from a3 as we checked out, in the meantime, white would have lost the opportunity of a much better move. And that much better move, in fact, immediately creates checkmate. And that move is moving the queen to d4. Again, we can see the two side pieces near the black king. And because of those highlighted by green pieces, the black king has no escape on either side. We want to point out that in this example, unlike in the previous one, the white rook is also assisting by taking away escape squares of black's king on the 7th rank. Let's see our next example. Here we go. In this position, we can tell that black has a whole bunch more pieces than white. And the problem is that if you combine their value, that is black's 2 rooks and bishop, that's clearly more than white's most valuable piece, the queen. As of pawns, there are even numbers to each. So in a situation like this, it's always important to be aware of the moves that attack the black king. Why? Because they may end up giving a fork, which means attacking the king and perhaps another enemy piece, or even better, white may give checkmate, giving the correct check. In this position, it is highly unlikely that white would be able to give a fork, a double attack, because all of the black pieces protect each other. So even if white would, let's say, be able to give a check that attack the rook on h3 with the queen, it would not be helpful, as that rook is protected by black's pawn on g4. So therefore, trying to give a fork or a skewer to try to win one of the black pieces is not a realistic option in this case. But on the other hand, white can go straight for the kill. And again, the sad part for black is the 2 pieces that are taking away important escape squares from the black king. So in this case, it's important to look around. What are the squares where the black king at the moment would be trying to run away? And one would be c7, another one would be d8, and yet another one would be d6. So if we are trying to checkmate the king, obviously we would need to look for a way to attack the king, check the king, as well as take control of those 3 squares all at once. And the only move that achieves that goal is moving the queen up to e7. Luckily, the pawn from f6 protects, and as we can tell, the black king now has no escape. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. For a change, there is no queen on the board. And yet, it's still an Epaulette mate because the idea we're trying to use is very similar to the previous ones. Namely, that 2 black pieces again take away important escape routes of the black king. The black king at the moment is already stuck. It has no place to go, so all white needs to do is to attack the king. Naturally, the white bishop cannot even potentially attack the king as long as that king is in a light square, as white's bishop can only cover squares on the chessboard that are of dark color. So therefore, the only potential attack on the black king at the moment is the white knight. In fact, that white knight has 2 different ways to attack the black king. However, only one of them achieve our goal. Giving the check from d6 would not be sufficient, because even though the black king cannot move, the knight can be captured. And in fact, this would be a big mistake, because then after pawn takes rook, white would also lose the bishop on f6, leaving black with an extra knight and the winning position. On the other hand, if white continues correctly and attacks black king from the right side, that is from g7, that knight cannot be captured there, and the black king has no escape. Let's move on to the next example. And now we got to situations when we're dealing with checkmates in 2 or more moves. It's no longer a one-move deal. Obviously, that's a lot more complex, and you'll only have a chance to figure out these situations if you are getting comfortable with the one movers. Now, in this situation, the black king is not yet in a position where the white queen would be ready to checkmate. And in fact, the white queen has a good number of checks to give to black's king. I can see a whole bunch, for example, b7, c7, d7, c4, d5, e6, or even g6. So plenty of choices. They all attack the black king, and yet all of them but one would miss out on the forced checkmate that white can give if they indeed find the correct solution. To give you a hint, what white needs to accomplish is to force the black king onto a situation where those two rooks on f8 and h8 will be in a king's way of escaping the checks. For example, after a check with queen d7, the black king could go either back to g8 or it could go also to f6. And white does not have a follow-up that would checkmate the black king. Also, checking the king from g6 wouldn't be sufficient because as the king escapes to e7 and then it can escape to d8. So the only correct sequence right now is to check black's king with queen e6. Now the black king has only one legal response, namely to move the king to g7. And now we can recognize our pattern, namely that the two rooks are taking away the runaway squares of the king. And now, hopefully you can figure out the final move. If not, take a couple of minutes to try to do it. The answer is queen g6, and it's checkmate. Again, it's extremely important for white that they do have the pawn which protects the white queen. Let's move on to the next example. And here we go. In this position, you can recognize real quick that black has a significant material advantage in an extra rook. Black has just moved his queen to c4 in hopes to exchange the queens. In a situation when one side has material advantage, especially if it's a significant one like here, having a rook, which white does not have, succeeding with the exchange of the queens would almost guarantee a winning position. However, the catch is that white is not forced to do black a favor and exchange the queens. White has other options, and white has much better options. Now, at the same time, it's quite important to play forcefully and not give black the time to improve the position of his pieces, such as the knight on h6 or the rook in the corner, or indeed start attacking the white king himself with checks. So here there is no time to waste, and it's really important that white starts the attack with a forceful move with a check. Queen to f8. Now this queen is protected now by the bishop on a3. Therefore, the king cannot capture the queen, and once the king moves to its only square, which is h7, now white is ready to checkmate. Again, we can see the two pieces that take away escape options of the black king. Queen g7 arrives and checkmate. A very typical pattern that happens in many games. Let's move on. And here is the next example. Again, we can tell that black has a whole bunch more pieces than white. Black has a bishop and a knight and an extra pawn, in addition to the other pieces that both sides have, such as the queen and the rooks. So if it were black's turn, black certainly would have sufficient time to defend against any of the white potential threats. But in our example, it is white's turn. Typically, if white would make a move that would not be a check, that would be kind of a quiet move, that would give black the time to defend from any potential attack. Now white has two reasonable checks in this position. One of them would be the check from b2, which would be a mistake because it would allow the black king to run away to g6. And then after another check with the queen, black could either go back with the king or simply block the check with the knight, which at the same time would revive the black rook, which now would be assisting the black queen in the attack against white's king. So if the check from b2 is not what white is looking for, what is the only other option that can force black to defend against the check? Well, that move is to move the queen up to e5. What happens now is the black king has no choice, has only one legal move, namely to move up to g6. Again, we see the pattern with the two black pieces on f7 and h7, taking away important escape squares from the king, and now white is ready to checkmate with queen g5, epaulette mate again. Let's move on. Here we go. In this position again, black's material advantage is visually visible with two extra rooks and an extra bishop. And again, white's fortune is that it is their turn. The difficult part may be, for an inexperienced player, that white seemingly has a whole bunch of good-looking options. For example, you may be pleased to notice that if you move your knight to g6, you would not only be attacking the black king, which is a check, but also the black queen. Now, here is the important message. It's not enough to find a good move. You need to look around and see if you have an even better one. In this case, this knight check, this fork, while it looks like a good move, would miss out on a much better one, because after king moves out of this check and knight takes, black still would have a winning material advantage. On the other hand, if white finds the correct move, white is able to checkmate in just two moves. Now, if the white queen moves to b7, checking the black king, it almost works, because if the king moves to d8, indeed white achieves the checkmate which we are looking for. The problem is that after queen b7, black has choices. And this is when the rule to always look out for your opponent's best moves as well comes in so importantly. Here black has a choice to move the king elsewhere, for example to f6, and avoid all kind of troubles. On the other hand, the correct move, which is queen to e6, greatly restricts the black king. In fact, it limits it to only one option, moving to d8. And now the same checkmate that would have worked after queen b7, king d8, queen d7 again results the same final position. Checkmate. Let's move on to the next position. Here we go. In this example, it is white's turn again. There is almost material equality. Black just has one extra little pawn. Now this is somewhat different from our previous examples, because here white does not have a forceful mate in 2 moves. However, white can use that same pattern to win significant material. In this position, if you use your imagination a little bit and you imagine the white rook from d3 disappearing, you'll notice that when it's gone, the white queen would be ready to checkmate with queen b5, our usual Epaulette typical checkmate. However, we cannot just jump over it or move it off the board and make another move. That's not allowed by the rules. On the other hand, we can make a move that does everything in our power to get rid of that rook. And the best way to accomplish that is to capture the enemy rook on d8. Now, if black recaptures, which would be the natural move, then the queen indeed comes to b5 and it's game over. On the other hand, if the black queen does not capture the white rook, then white simply have won a rook. Now you may wonder, could white have tried to give up the rook with a more forceful move such as the check? Certainly could, but would also regret it if black finds the correct response. And in this case, that would be capturing the rook with the pawn, because that clears up the c7 escape square for the black king, as after queen b5, king c7 escapes. And finally, let's see our last example in this lesson. Here we go. In this position, black has an extra knight. Other than that, the other material is even. Again, we need to use our imagination and imagining that the rook from d5 is gone. If that would be gone, indeed, then the white queen could go to g8 and announce checkmate. Again, we can see 2 black pieces that are around the black king, causing the trouble. So here white's task is to successfully get rid of that rook. And the most forceful way to accomplish that is by giving a check, rook d7. Even though the black bishop can capture it, white doesn't mind, because again, the white queen comes to g8 thanks to the protection of the bishop from a2, and it's checkmate. Black could get out of the check in other ways, for example moving the king up, but it wouldn't change anything. The queen would still appear on g8, announcing checkmate. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, learning about the beautiful Epaulette mate, and you'll be back to learn more next week with some interesting ideas. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.